بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم افتح بخير واختم بخير وأنت خير الفاتحين اغفر وارحم وتجاوز عما تعلم إنك أنت الأعز الأكرم. All praise and glory to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Lord of the heavens and the earth, and the best prayers and most perfect salutations to his Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like he gathered us here today, and also the brothers online, that he gather us with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the highest levels of Jannah. Our topic, another seminar of Seekers Guidance today, another valuable seminar with a valuable scholar at Seekers Guidance here today with our brothers here in Istanbul, and also our brothers and sisters joining from all over the world, is a very important one. And it's about how to organize our studies of Islamic studies, especially in this day and age, especially in this day where many people, alhamdulillah, are returning to the Islamic tradition and trying to understand and get a glimpse of how to understand the tradition and how to study the tradition. And there are so many things online, and there are so many, ways and ways that people are suggesting we study Islamic studies, and so many approaches, especially in the last 100 years, where many people are suggesting different approaches to approaching Islamic studies. So in this light, and many of us students of knowledge want to understand the system that our scholars have put. Alhamdulillah, our scholars have not left us without anything, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used them in his way. And one of those scholars that tried to explain to us and put this forward to us and make it easier for us is the scholar Sajuqlizadeh. I'm not going to introduce him, as our valuable Sheikh Talal inshallah will introduce him. But Sajuqlizadeh, in his book Tartīb al-ʿulūm, organizing the ʿulūm, organizing the sciences, meaning the Islamic sciences, and he lays out, he carefully lays this out. It's in a reasoned sequence, and how to acquire the Islamic sciences, from Arabic to Quran, the grammar and logic and fiqh and aqeedah and hadith. He organizes this for us, rahimahullah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant him the highest levels of Jannah. So in this seminar, we're going to, inshallah, try to understand the work of Sajuqlizadeh and how, what influenced him and how he was writing, what was his manhaj and way and approach. And as well, we're going to tackle with our dear Sheikh Talal, what does it mean to be a real scholar, especially in the world today where we have everyone's talking about Islamic sciences and everyone has the ability to go out there and, put a message out there. So what does it mean to really be a complete Islamic scholar? With us here today is our very own here at Seekers Guidance, very proudly our own dear Sheikh Talal Al-Azem. Sheikh Talal Al-Azem is a scholar and teacher and researcher in the Islamic sciences with interest especially in fiqh, Islamic education and formations of the self in Islam. He's studied in many different places, especially in Syria, Sham, and in Turkey, before completing a doctorate. He's a translator of prayers of occasion, a handbook of Sunnah prayers, and he's also authored books and research papers. He's taught, mashallah, in academies, meaning in academies and universities, and he did so in the UK and here, as well as seminars in traditional Islamic learning. So he's very equipped, inshallah, to be talking to us about this topic. We're very happy to have you here today with us, Sheikh. May Allah reward you and bless you, and we're all easy to you, inshallah.
Barakallahu feekum. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa baraka ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad al-Fatih lima ughliq al-khatimi lima sabaq nasir al-haqqi bil-haqq wal-hadi ila siratika al-mustaqim wa ala alihi haqqa qadrihi miqdarihi al-azim. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا فعلمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. Alhamdulillah wa shukrillah. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today on this topic, as was just very ably introduced. And so our subject this seminar is how to arrange your studies of the Islamic sciences, with specifically advice from Imam Sajuqlizadah. This topic is a perennially important one, because so long as there are people who are seeking out sacred knowledge and want to understand how best to pursue this, you will find that throughout our history, from the earliest centuries until our own age today, there have been people who have tried to produce guidance, maps, you could say, and a framework within which to understand the pursuit of knowledge in general, and more particularly, in the case of what we'll be speaking about today, the pursuit of the Islamic sciences, or the revelatory and religious sciences. So I'm going to proceed today in a hopefully methodological fashion. We'll say a few words about our author, Imam Sajuqlizadah, and about the work upon which this presentation is based. To be very clear, we're not going to be treating the entirety of the work in a short session, but we're going to be looking at one specific section from it that treats this question of the arrangement of the sciences for the student, specifically this question. Then we'll, through this lens, we'll be looking at the questions that the author tried to address. Primarily, why is it that many students flounder or fail in their studies? What is it that is important to know, in what order, what to study, and when to study it? So this comes to the core of what we're talking about here in the arranging of one's studies of the Islamic sciences. And we'll see that he has advice for the very beginner who's a child, or the beginner who is an adult. At some point they converge. We'll then treat with our author the question of the levels of mastery of any given discipline, and what this means for how one should approach not just the subjects as a whole, but even a given subject. And we'll see with our author here, as he draws from scholars such as Imam al-Ghazālī and others, that it's very important that one doesn't begin to specialize too early because of the negative effects this has on one's ability to bring sciences and ʿulūm together as a whole in the person of the scholar. So we'll be addressing this at the end. What does it mean to have mastery or completeness, as was introduced earlier, and what does it not mean? And hopefully have some reflections on this as well. And we'll close with a short reflection drawn from throughout the author's text here on the necessary connection between morality and between knowledge. And that'll be our closing remarks, inshallah ta'ala. So let's begin then from the first point of just trying to understand a little bit more about our author, Imam Sajuqlizadah. The Imam was his full name Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr al-Mar'ashi al-Hanafi. Al-Mar'ashi is in reference to the town or the city of Marash, renamed about 50 years ago in Turkey, Kahraman Marash, in southeast or southwest Turkey, very close to the Syrian border. Given this title 50 years ago because many of its residents had resisted during the War of Independence here in Turkey, the French occupying forces, and so the city was renamed the heroic Marash. But throughout history it was known simply as Islamic history, simply known as Marash, and he himself is sometimes known as al-Marashi or Sajuqlizadah, which is the name of his family. He himself was born into a family of knowledge. His father was an Imam and a teacher himself in Marash, and he studied with a number of scholars in Malatya, in Sivas, generally in the south of Turkey, before then repeatedly traveling to Damascus, where he studied then tafsir, Quranic exegesis, hadith, and tasawwuf, Sufism, under the celebrated scholar Abdul Ghani Nabulsi, from whom he received his own ijaza and a khilafa in tasawwuf. So he was an authorized scholar initiating disciples into both the Qadiriyya tariqa and the Naqshbandiyya tariqa. So as a scholar, he was a scholar noted both for his outward knowledges, in his early life especially, a very prominent author whose works are in print until today in Ilm al-Kalam, and at the same time of the inward sciences, of the spiritual sciences. So when he returned from his final sojourn to Damascus, he devoted himself in Marash to writing, to teaching, and to irshad, to spiritual guidance. He's not known to have had any official appointment in the Ottoman Ilmiya, which is to say the organized higher education. And in fact, there's not even evidence that he had traveled to Istanbul at all, which is, if one thinks of him as an Ottoman scholar, perhaps somewhat surprising. But seeing that again, in a world before borders, he was in the cultural space of what is Greater Syria, Northern Iraq, Kurdistan, then this is one cultural zone itself and with its own long-standing educational traditions. And again, he made multiple journeys to Damascus, which was its own capital of knowledge at the time in many ways, as it has been throughout Islamic history. So despite, however, not having had any such appointments, he continued in the footsteps of his father, being an Imam of a mosque where he taught, and he transmitted both the traditional sciences as well as the rational sciences, as well as giving spiritual guidance as a murshid. He often traveled to other neighboring cities like Aintab, today's Ghazi Aintab, and Kilis to provide spiritual instruction. And as I mentioned, he was an author of numerous works, prolific, writing dozens of works. By the smallest account, at least 30 works across tafsir, kalam, logic, dialectics, the art of disputation, fiqh, tasawwuf, ethics, and very importantly for our session here this evening, on the topic of how to classify and organize the sciences for students. There's some dispute over his date of death, ranging from 1145 in the Hijri calendar, which is 1732 in the Common Era, to 1155, approximately 1742. So some say he was buried in Marash, others say he was buried in Aintab, where he had gone, as was his tradition, his custom, to give spiritual guidance, and that he died on the way and was buried there. So he's often commemorated in poetry as Shaykh al-Sajuqli or Taj al-Murshideen, the crown of spiritual guides. And his Sufi reputation is expressed by Findiqli, who characterizes him as one who was, quote, cultivated in the Zahir, as in the knowledge of the heart, illuminated in the Batin. And so this is a rather befitting summary of our scholar's standing. So let's turn our attention now to the book itself, Tartīb al-ʿulūm. The book was completed in 1128, that is to say in the year 1715 or 1716 of the Common Era. There are many surviving manuscripts of this work, demonstrating that it was widely read after his time, and was even translated in the very late 1800s, in the era of the Young Turks in the Ottoman Empire, from Arabic into Turkish, as an argument for revising and updating the educational system of the time. And so you have a work nearly more than 150 years old at that time, being translated to Turkish for its arguments. Now the title of the book itself, Tartīb al-ʿulūm, has a dual signification, as can be gleaned from an analysis of the book itself. Tartīb al-ʿulūm can indicate a hierarchy of the sciences in light of their subject matters, their purposes, their interrelationships, and their dependencies. Okay, what is known in the Latin tradition, but also through Avicenna in the Islamic world, as the notion of subalternation, that some sciences derive their first principles from other sciences. Okay, and so one has to be aware, and in fact this is one of the reasons he writes the book, that one has to be aware of foundational sciences and how other later sciences are premised upon them, how their conclusions often lead to the premises or the first starting points, the foundations of other disciplines. Okay, and secondly, the title indicates tartib in the sense of how to order the study of one's sciences, which is the focus of our study, getting together here today. Okay, so in other words, a dual meaning of the hierarchy of knowledge as well as the ordering of one's studies in pursuit of that knowledge. So the book is thus organized into a preface, an introduction, and two main parts. So the heart of the book are these two main parts with a conclusion and a short epilogue. In the preface, our author lays out very clearly from the very first lines who he is addressing. And so he says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillahi wassalamu ala ibadihi alladhina istafa, Rabbana atina min ladunka rahmatan wa hayyi' lana min amrina rashadan wa ba'd. فيقول البائس الفقير محمد المرعشي المدعو بساجقليزادeh أكرمه الله سبحانه بالفوز والسعادة. So after praising Allah and sending his benedictions upon the Prophet and praying to Allah to grant us from him, directly from him, a mercy and to prepare all of us for that which is guided in good, he says, اعلموا معاشر الطلبة, know, O students. Okay, so he's clearly from the very first word, the addressee, the intended readership here are students, those who are on the path of seeking knowledge. أصلح الله أموركم ومد أعماركم وأحيا بكم رسوم الدين وهدى بكم قوما آخرين. And so a prayer for all of those who are seeking knowledge from his time until ours, that by means of whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may rectify the affairs of all mankind. He says, اعلموا معاشر الطلبة أنه كان يوجد في كل قرن من القرون الماضية من هذه الأمة طائفة من العلماء المؤلفين والأعلام المحققين وخلى الآن من أمثالهم الجوانب. So he says in short that in addressing the student, O student, you should know that throughout history there had been scholars who authored, scholars who taught in every decade, in every century, people who dedicated their lives, a ta'ifa, who set themselves aside in following the command of the Quran that there be in every peoples, there be those who set themselves aside for recollection of knowledge. And he said, and today this has nearly vanished. The likes of these scholars, he says, has nearly vanished. And in their stead, you have people who are, he says in the Arabic Saja, he says they're like rabbits amongst lions. Those who really don't have, they're there, they have some movement, but they're not of the stature of those who had come before. So he's beginning by laying a framework in order to remind scholars and students of knowledge that you have to motivate yourself not just with a sense of desire for knowledge, but in how best to go about pursuing this. And this is really the framework in which he lays out the rest of the book. So we'll come back to some of these points as we proceed. In the introduction, he then turns his attention to the notion of beneficial knowledge. Okay, so again, laying out immediately the idea that there is knowledge that is of benefit and there is knowledge that is harmful. And there is a category of knowledge that may not intrinsically by itself be beneficial or harmful. Okay, and depending on your intention and your use of it, it might become this or it might become that. But he begins with, in other words, a moral framework. And indeed, elsewhere in the text, he ties this explicitly to the categories of the jurists, of the fuqaha, the well-known ahkam of something being obligatory or being mandatory or being encouraged or being simply permissible or discouraged or prohibitively disliked or forbidden. Again, these are not just merely sometimes translated legal categories. Law is, if we think about law today, law is either legal or illegal. It's either black or white. But these are categories that are also imbued with moral meaning. Okay, meaning that the person who's going to set about that action, whatever the action might be, including the act of seeking knowledge, must be mindful as to its moral status, the status of that act. Is it obligatory? Is it encouraged? Is it merely permissible? Or is it below that line? And so he frames from the very beginning of his introduction the entirety of the act of pursuing knowledge within this moral framework. And of course, in doing so, he's standing in a long line of very great and eminent scholars who likewise saw everything in this framework. Why? not because knowledge is to simply be a matter of utility, but because knowledge is ultimately a means of mankind drawing close to their Lord, which he will come back to elsewhere in this text, both as individuals and as humanity altogether. So he talks about the moral status of learning various sciences and arts, again, across these degrees of the fuqaha, and introduces the topic that we're going to then focus on primarily in our presentation and seminar today, the concept of degrees, maratib, or levels, you could say, of mastering the sciences. So he simply introduces it in the introduction, and then we'll come back to it and we'll be focusing on that part a bit later. Part one of the book, which we largely will not treat today, except to take a few comments here and there, is the longest part of the book, and it's where he surveys and defines virtually all of the classical sciences that were taught in the Ottoman madrasa and education system of his time. All right, so the late 1600s, early 1700s in the Common Era. And he sets about demonstrating the benefit of them, what's beneficial of them, as well as pointing out poor decisions often made by students of knowledge in seeking their knowledge of these sciences. In other words, the sciences or the books might in themselves be helpful, but the bad decisions made by students in how they go about learning can cause them to either slow down or actually miss the mark completely. And we'll touch upon this a little bit later. In the first part, he also provides bibliographical lists of the texts and handbooks and that were used in the time period that he is writing in. And again, he ties all of this back to the moral categories that we mentioned in the introduction. In part two of the book, which is much shorter than the first part, he addresses what we're going to talk about today, which is the order in which the necessary and beneficial sciences should be learned. And he expands upon the model of the 3 levels of mastering every science, from beginners to intermediates to advanced students. And again, this will be the mainstay of our seminar today. Okay. And then he concludes with some closing remarks, especially on kalam, which he was actually a specialist in, but has a few words of critique on some of the ways that people went about kalam in his own age, and the imbalances that he felt this led to, as well as on philosophy as a subject matter as a whole. We won't have time to get into these. It was beyond the scope of our presentation, but again, just to alert that there's interesting discussions there for people who are interested in these, in this topic. Okay. Now, the work as a whole stands, as I mentioned, in a very long tradition from across the Islamic world, from all corners. From the early Islamic history, authors such as Farabi or Kindi or Khwarizmi, to later scholars like Avicenna, Imam Ghazālī, Fakhruddin al-Razi, Ibn al-Akfani, Ibn Khaldun, and to India, like authors such as Tahanawi. And even in the Ottoman realm itself, this was a very popular genre. Mullah Lutfi wrote a work known as Mawdu'āt al-ʿulūm al-ʿarabiyya wal-shar'iyya in 1494 of the Common Era. Sajuqlizadeh, he wrote likewise Miftah al-Sa'ādah wa Misbah al-Siyādah, published today as 3 volumes, translated into Turkish, which means it had a much wider later readership. And many other scholars, Yahya Navai Effendi, Katib Chalabi, and others. So, like I said, it stands in a long line of scholars before him and after him, for that matter, until our very own age. So the question that is reasonable to ask about this book then is, what makes it so unique? You know, why focus on some of the passages and arguments of Sajuqlizadeh's work? And as I've already hinted at when talking about the preface and reading a few lines from it, it's because this work almost uniquely is written as a handbook and guidance to students of knowledge in their pursuit. So he's addressing those who are seeking structure and looking to avoid the pitfalls that he has identified in his own age, and that perhaps some of these things we might find in our own age likewise today for those who are in active pursuit of the religious or sacred sciences. I should be very clear that his discussion of knowledge is not limited to these revealed and sacred sciences, the religious sciences, but it is the thrust of his work. He does talk about other disciplines that are outside of that scope, which he largely deems to be either merely permissible or at some times recommended. But he doesn't frame it in his moral categories, the non-religious sciences, in the same way, because of the ultimate purpose of knowledge. Again, ultimately, it's the religious sciences, as he argues, that provide the framework for the sa'adah, for the well-being of the individual, human, and of mankind as a whole. And everything else then is a means. And those means need to be judged according to their utility or their help or their harm. Okay, so again, some discussions that will be left for a different session perhaps. Okay, so this book is really a book of practical pedagogy, of method, and of how to go about learning. And he, as I said, draws very heavily on scholars who preceded him, but especially of note is Imam Ghazālī, who he references numerous times in almost every section, every chapter. And like Imam Ghazālī, as we'll close with today, emphasizing the symbiotic relationship between morality and ethics, and between knowledge and knowing. Okay, but in the framework of somebody who's writing in the 12th century of the Hijrah or the 18th century of the Common Era. So again, a updated version of what many people had done before, but with a singular-minded focus of advising the students of his age. Okay, now you'll notice if you do peruse the book, read it beyond what we're going to cover today, that Imam Sajuqlizadeh appears sometimes quite critical of what might be classified as dysfunctional trends in madrasa education during his age. And again, he wasn't the first. Kochi Bey, Katib Chalabi, and others had themselves voiced complaints about some aspects of how students were going about studying, even in the centuries before, and learning, especially in the madrasa. So what Sajuqlizadeh says he's trying to do is to provide the student, the reader of this book, a better approach to pursuing the sciences and seeking mastery of them. So the book really provides a window into discussions over pedagogy, curriculum, and the role of the different sciences and the arrangement of these sciences in his time. And there's wisdoms in them that transcend his time, which is why we're reflecting on some of them here today. Okay, so we'll begin then with turning our attention to the first thing that he addresses in his preface and introduction, which is the question of why many students flounder or actually fail, despite putting in effort, despite sometimes putting in the years, but they don't hit the heights of mastery that he is laying out a path towards. And so he begins in his very preface, rahimahullah, by making it clear, as we said, that this is addressed to students, and that, as we said, he wants them to reflect that there were in previous centuries those who were brilliant in the sciences, but over the centuries and by his time, people had dulled. And he said this, in his assessment, is not because of the intrinsic capacities of people had changed, or because the ʿulūm or the scholarship had that they had access to was any worse, but rather because, unlike in previous ages where students used to focus, so this is the first core argument of his book, that in previous ages students used to focus their minds on the core primary classical texts, or the mutun, across all sciences of import. In other words, they would ensure that they conceptualized and understood the most important masail. And they did so in a holistic fashion. In other words, for each and every science, they covered a metin at least that treated all and introduced all of the key questions of that discipline. Not simply sampling a number of them, not going deep within one or two chapters and to the exclusion of the others, but ensured that they understood what the first masala and the last masala all had to say about this discipline taken holistically. Okay? And secondly, that the students would do so across all of the disciplines, ensuring that likewise each subject matter, each science, each discipline was not something that imposed itself upon the mind and the formation of the student singularly, so they could only speak about one science or only think in one mode, but rather that they imbibed within themselves, again, a total holistic approach to ilm and knowledge, such that each science is understood as a window onto an aspect of reality and not the only vantage point at all. Okay, so this is the first reason why he says, these are the first two things that he begins with as to why students sometimes flounder and flail. So he says the mutun, of course, continue to exist, but when the number of commentaries and super commentaries, shuruh and hawashi and ta'liqat, or the marginalia, proliferated, he says for many students and many systems of education, like the madrasa system of the Ottomans, of which he was observing and critiquing, the system of education became very heavy upon students. It became very confusing. And sometimes teachers themselves wouldn't help by focusing on a given science, or even sometimes not a single science, sometimes a single book. And sometimes not even a single book, but a single mas'ala, as he's going to illustrate a little bit later, such that students might spend a whole year on one question without yet having cultivated, not because the question is maybe of no importance, but because it's barring them from that holistic cultivation which he is so keen on. So as a result of getting lost in these super commentaries and hawashi and these ta'liqat, he says students came to abandon systematic study of the core questions of every science. And sometimes they abandon sciences entirely. And again, we see this critique even amongst some of the authors from the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s in the subcontinent. We see this critique in the Arab world. So this is a critique which Sajuqlizadeh within his context perhaps is voicing most strongly, but he's not alone in this. Where many scholars, he said, have come to, or students of knowledge who become scholars, study a part of a given science, while other sciences they would try to master through direct engagements right away with super commentaries or shuruh, but before they've mastered the core well-known topics, and as such they wouldn't actually acquire really anything. So their minds, it's not that their minds were not capable, but they were not prepared for the complexities and the detailed and probabilistic debates, so that they would just get lost in a long list of conflicting opinions. Okay? And so he says, as a result of this, many students didn't understand what they were reading. They spent months reading these hawashi, but in the total sum effect was not to actually make them brighter and sharper, but to dull their intellects. Because when somebody consistently tries to read something they don't understand, the impact on this is a dulling of the mind, rather a sharpening of the mind. And this is not a unique argument. This is something that even much earlier than him, one of the early authors on pedagogy, Imam al-Zarnuji from Central Asia, he writes in his own Ta'lim al-Muta'allim that if a student fails to strive hard in understanding and slackens and fails to understand time after time, he'll become accustomed to not understanding and think that it's normal, in other words. And until the student no longer even understands simple questions. They've dulled their minds through studying rather than sharpen their minds. A perverse consequence. And so similarly, if not worse, Sajuqlizadeh warns, are students who attend lectures that they don't understand. So this just compounds the matter. They spend hours traveling and sitting and learning, so to speak, but they walk away with very little, or worse, they walk away with no actual understanding, only being able to, what we'd call today, drop names of titles or drop names of works. So the problem then as he frames it, is not the existence of commentaries, of course, or super commentaries. He authored many of these himself. Quite the contrary, these have to be mastered, but only after understanding the foundational questions and mastering them. Okay, or literally, as we're going to see a little bit later, as he calls it, encompassing them. Okay, that there has to be an encompassing of these things. So he says some students, they err in how they arrange the sciences that they study. And they err in the amount of effort spent on any given science. Okay, so 2 points of critique here, of warning. An error on how you arrange it, and an error in how much time and how much effort you spend on a given science. Okay, such that, he says, that they commence the study of certain disciplines and sciences before having mastered their prerequisites. Those prerequisites being necessary to be able to even really fully understand what it is that they're dealing with. Okay, so this is what he observes in some of the students. He says, on the other hand, others, and he's also lamenting this point, they pay no heed to understanding a science for which there's a great need. But instead, he says, they spend inordinate amounts of time delving into questions in sciences for which there's no great need in society. So this is a second observation and critique of students of his age, that they, again, perhaps hyper-specialize, as we would call it today, a malady today, even in modern university research and teaching, just as it was in his own age. But we see this again in our own age today, even with students of the sacred sciences and religious sciences as well, to the point that they don't spend time on things that people need to understand, need someone to have mastery over to address the problems of the age, and instead they just wallow in questions for which there's little need or little benefit. So all of these considerations and these ill-advised approaches to managing their studies, he says, are the very reason for the decline of learning among students and for why they flounder and why they fail to reach their goals. Okay? And so he says, in concluding this section, he says, thus, I'm quoting here from him, I want to inform all of you of فَأَرَدْتُ أَنْ أُنَبِّئَكُمْ مَعَاشِرَ الطَّلَبَةِ بِخَيْرٍ مِنْ ذَلِكَ. He says, I want to inform all of you students, in total, مَعَاشِرَ الطَّلَبَةِ, all of you who are reading this and hearing this, of a better approach. بخير من ذلك. وأدلكم على تجارة تنجيكم عما يرضيكم بإنشاء actually we'll just stop there. عما يرضيكم by his writing this letter, he says, and to guide you to a way of doing this business of learning, tijara, of course, being a trade, but in this sense, not of the conventional sense, but of what you expend in order to what you gain, that will save you from what would otherwise lead to your own downfall. So it's an important message, and one that indeed any student would be very grateful to receive from the likes of Sajuqlizadah in his age and thereafter. So with this, again, this is the closing of his opening comments. We're going to go straight to the focus of our seminar here today, which is the importance of knowing what to study and when to study it. Okay, the importance of knowing what to study and when to study it. So, having addressed in the preface the students and alerted them to why often students fail to achieve their intended objectives in seeking knowledge, Imam Sajuqlizadah begins to introduce the normative status, the ahkam, in his introduction that we're just summarizing as we've already summarized. So again, what is beneficial, what is not beneficial, what are the ahkam, and focusing especially on the rational aqli sciences as well as the transmitted naqli sciences, which the rational ones are ultimately meant as handmaidens to serve. In the first part of the major part of the book, as I outlined earlier, he then surveys all of the sciences that were known. But it's in part 2, which is al-Maqsad al-Thani, which has 2 subparts to it, that he turns to the question of what is important to know and how and when should one study it. So what is it that one should do and when should one do? So in other words, to say it slightly differently, in exposition, a bayan, he says, الفصل الأول في بيان ترتيب العلوم لمن أراد تحصيلها. So an exposition of the ordering of sciences for students who wish to acquire them. And the second فصل في بيان مراتب العلوم, an exposition of the pedagogical levels. And even though he doesn't use that word or any Arabic equivalent, it's clear by reading that he's not talking about the maratib al-ulum from an epistemic perspective. He's speaking about it from a pedagogical perspective. Okay, having talked about some of the more epistemic questions earlier in part 1 of the book, and of which other authors before him and until our own age have addressed as well. Okay, so an exposition of the pedagogical levels or degrees, you could say, of the sciences, according to which a student should proceed within every science. Okay, so there's 2 aspects then here. Number 1, the ordering of the sciences, and second, the degrees or 3 levels, as he's going to lay out, within every science. Okay, so we begin with the first of these, how to arrange the arts and sciences, the funun and the ulum, for learning. And so here he begins with his first point of practical advice to the mubtadi. He says the beginner should begin with being given instruction in foundational faith, iman. And in fact, this point is for children and for adults alike. If a person is new to the deen as an adult, for example, or a child who is now of my age and the ability to understand, he says the learner should first be given instruction, yulaqan, and this talqeen is an important point because it entails an active process of the teacher with the student in a fashion that's craft-like. In other words, you have a person who is the substance that you're working on, and you're trying to form something out of this. You're trying to arrive at something. So it's not a matter of just giving them a book, or in our own age, a link to a YouTube lecture, but actually working with the student to ensure that they have the foundations according to the child's ability to understand, or the adult's readiness for particulars, but that the foundations of faith, he said, this is the primary and first thing. And there's no point proceeding into anything else. One might ask why, from a pedagogical perspective, is this? Shouldn't he have started with, let's say, literacy or numeracy or something of the sort? And indeed, while he will come to these points, foundational faith is the lens, the faith, your understanding and belief is the lens by which you're going to look through and at everything else in existence, including yourself, including the natural world, including your very purpose of being. And so if this lens, in the eyes of authors like al-Ghazālī, Sajuqlizadeh, and Sajuqlizadah, if this lens, so to speak, is clear, then you'll see properly. Whereas if the lens is not clear, you might perceive particulars, but you won't see the bigger picture. Or you might even misperceive what those particulars are and think them to be something that they are not. Okay, so faith in this case is not just a matter of, again, catechisms or things that you memorize and you move on, or give somebody a book and say, here, read this and come back in 20 minutes. But it's about giving them that understanding of what it means to say, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadun Rasulullah, at the most foundational level, according, he says, to the child's ability to understand or the adult's capacity at this first stage. Tamam. Following this then is, he says, the correct recitation of the Quran at the hands of a teacher, of a mu'allim who is sahih al-adai, whose own execution is sound, who's sahih, is until the student, here now speaking about a child, okay, at this point now he begins with what's different for a child, different from an adult, at the hands of a teacher whose own execution is sound, until that student, that child, completes recitation of the whole Quran. So he says this is the second thing to be done after foundational faith. And indeed, until our own age, especially in lands that, as he calls them himself, Ajami lands, where Arabic is not the native tongue, this is often a practice that is done amongst educated families or children who want to educate their children. But it's important to note that this is not the beginning and the end. It comes after the foundational faith at the level that a child can understand. So you have to engage the child according to their abilities, because children, as you all know, even at a young age of 4, 5, 6, 7, they sometimes ask very truly deep questions. And they can be given answers according to what they're able to reason with. But it shouldn't be something that one brushes off and jumps straight into just a rote practice, an inherited practice of sending the child to the local imam to do a khatam. It has to be within a bigger framework. Okay? But he says this is important because it gives them that ability to read and to engage with the book of Allah, the uncreated word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. طيب. From here, he says now the third point is a study of some detailed articles of belief of Ahl Sunnah. So the foundational faith was very foundational, as I said. But now it comes to ensuring that the student understands some of the particulars, again, according to their age and their abilities, of the beliefs of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, so that they don't just bump into somebody someday at the age of 10, 12, and get taken by a far-fetched idea that has no basis in the way of the Sunnah and of the community of the Muslims. And again, by this he's not speaking about details of kalam, which he's going to actually decry later. He's speaking about the articles of faith, but understanding them so that the person cannot, again, be hoodwinked by someone that they come across and pulls them off of the way of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. He says, now this is to be done, followed immediately by the study of the mandated measure القدر المفروض من علم الأخلاق, of ethics, okay, of the ʿulūm of human character. So you can see here how the formation of the human being ranks very high for him. This is even before studying the fiqh, or the rules, you should say, ahkam of prayer. Now, it's not to say that prayer is delayed. It's simply to emphasize, and in this he's doing what authors before him, like Imam Biographical and others, have said, which is that a person might be a Muslim and not be obliged to pray like a young child, as far as fardiyya is concerned, even if they are to be trained in it. But the elements that are going to be almost every moment, not just 5 times a day, are their actions, their speech acts, their physical acts. So the ethical and moral status of these acts, be it a child, so they cultivate this ability to act in the right fashion and in an ethical fashion, and also in an adult. Okay, so this is why, perhaps counterintuitively to what some people might think, he places the mandated measure, the modicum that everyone needs to know about lying, about actions of the tongue, or actions of the limbs, that a person might do 1,000 times a day, whereas the prayers are 5 times a day. And then after this, he says the prayer. Now, in order that we not be confused by this, these detailed articles of the beliefs, the mandated measures of akhlaq, the prayer, he says this is something that is provided amply by sometimes very short epistles or texts, such as he gives an example of Imam Biographi's Turkish Risala, as he calls it, which is probably referring to the Wasiyatname of Biography, translated in English often as the Testament, or known as the Risale Biography. So this is one of the key examples of a type of literature common in the later Ottoman period, from the 15th centuries to his own time, the 16th century to his own time, of ilm al-hal. Short works that address what every person in any given state, any given hal, needs to know of belief, of ethical moral comportment, and of the fundament of your relationship with Allah, which is prayer. Because not everybody is going to have to pay zakat. Not everybody is going to necessarily reach the month of Ramadan or have to fast Ramadan. As you know, there's many exceptions. But prayer is something that the vast majority, all but the most infirm or the very youngest, are going to have to do numerous times a day. And even this after akhlaq. And even this after knowing the fundaments, creedal points of one's Islam. Okay? And so, commenting on this text of Biographical, he says, and what an excellent work it is for every Ajami beginner. Again, written in Turkish, which I think is also an indication to our own age, in which perhaps other languages now have become lingua franca of Muslims around the world, that there should be such text authored in these languages as well that provide the beginning student, young and old, with these basic introductory forms. They need not necessarily mimic the model of the Ilm al-Hal books, though there's no necessary harm in that either, but that they seek out the same objectives, providing the core essential beliefs, essential ethical moral points of knowledge and instruction in the prayer before turning attention to anything else. And again, as he's going to say later, and any reflection in our own age might also demonstrate, many people who skip over these fundaments to go straight into deep studies of individual sciences in which their core knowledges have not yet been secured. Okay? Following from this then, we're still talking about the beginner child, the young child, who's been giving instruction. He says, and if the young child is not an Arab, in other words, Arabic is not their native tongue, this is what he means by Ajami, then to study a primer in Arabic diction. Okay? And he gives the example of a text by Ibn Malak or Ibn Farashta, who's sometimes better known for his works in other sciences like Usul al-Fiqh. But he had a book in diction, in a small lexicon of Arabic terms. So studying vocabulary as a means of familiarizing the young non-native Arabic-speaking student with the language by which he or she is going to then pursue the rest of their studies. Okay, so again, a useful and interesting point, which again finds precedent in other writings over the centuries before. Other texts from the 3rd or 4th century in earlier years had been used, again, to give like a little mini dictionary that students internalize. Okay, those of you who are maybe from North America, some of the listeners perhaps remotely here today, who are familiar with, for example, the life story of certain converts in the 20th century to Islam, such as the well-known Malcolm X, talks about how when he went into prison, found himself now completely cut off from the rest of the world that had gotten him into such troubles in the first place, and of course became Muslim in that setting, or was on the path to Islam of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, you could say. But one of the things he did is he basically studied and memorized the dictionary. And he mentioned, it's in his autobiography, how he'll never forget the aardvark, starting with 2-letter A's until he completed and basically memorized the dictionary, having very little else to do imprisoned. And this is part of what gave him the strength of his oratory skills, from which he was famous. So this type of advice perhaps is particularly relevant, again, in our age where the lingua franca of many Muslims is not Arabic or Farsi or Ottoman Turkish, or Urdu, but is other languages. Okay? Now, this was all for the beginning child. For the student, he says who is an adult, the previous one being for children, he says, again, foundational faith to the degree, to capacity of the adult now, which is different than the capacity of a child. Then followed, again, slightly different. Same general pattern, but tailored now to the intellectual and time capacities. He said Fatiha, the memorization of the Fatiha in some small surahs, because the adult must pray, whereas perhaps the young child maybe does not, and so they need to have this much at least. Then correct recitation of the Quran. Perhaps reading the entirety of the Mus'haf with, again, a teacher of talqeen. After this, detailed beliefs, ethics in prayer, again, in their own native language, like Imam Burgavi's Turkish, because the point here is they still don't necessarily have the Arabic, and even if they're Arabic speakers, they don't have scholarly Arabic. So give it to them in a way that can be quickly internalized, followed by the entirety of the Quran, okay, of which, again, we know from the time period of study, for most would have meant the memorization of the entirety of the Quran, followed by memorization of a primer in Arabic diction. Okay, so the study and the ability to recite the entirety of the Quran, and by means of this, of course, internalizing its diction, even at a level of aliyat, of instruments of knowledge. Before studying a primer in Arabic diction, like Ibn Farish does, the greatest source of your tongue of scholarship is going to be the Quran itself. And again, in the 20th century, one could find many even non-Muslims in the Arab world, in Lebanon, in other words, in the late 19th century, 1800s, and 1900s, who often would memorize parts or the entirety of the Quran, despite not being Muslims, because of their recognition of it as being the highest form of Arabic. And so if diction of Arabic is what you're after, nothing else will do. But of course, for the student's knowledge, it's not just a matter of diction, it's a matter of actually internalizing and coming to protect and be protected by, to be a hafiz of the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And thus, when one pursues all the other sciences, whatever they might be, to have as their starting point the reference of the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? Now, having addressed this for both the child and the adult, our author then says they move on. They move on now to the study of Arabic morphology, of sarf, and then syntax. Okay, so first sarf, and then nahu. So you can see an emphasis already here on the, again, ʿulūm al-āla, the instrumental or ancillary sciences that help you with getting into other things. Again, very different than what you see in many halaqat of learning, where people might, from a young age or in high school or in university age, spend years reading books and translations and things without having acquired the tools of learning. Okay, after this, he says, comes the rulings, ilm al-ahkam, which he clarifies is not the same thing as studying fiqh. Fiqh, as you'll see on the list here, comes last on this page. There's still another slide. So what is the difference then? Ahkam is knowing the actual rulings of what to do. And he says that's not fiqh. Fiqh means to have a deep understanding of something with its adillah, with its evidence, with its reasoning. This requires having studied usul al-fiqh. But you study ahkam first because you may need them yourself in your own life, whether you know or don't know their foundations. If you're married, if you're doing business, well, then you need to know in tijara, or you need to know in kitab al-nikah, the rules of these matters. And likewise, because it serves as the foundation to the study then of usul or qawaid. Anybody who's ever read a book of usul al-fiqh or qawaid fiqhiyya knows that they simply refer quickly to masail. If you don't understand those masail, you won't really be able to follow along easily, at least, the treatment of the usul or of the qawaid, the maxims of fiqh. So he says the rulings come after the study of morphology and of syntax. Again, you're building up malaka, skills, abilities, okay, as well as positive knowledge. Then he says logic. Okay, mantiq, all right, as an ala, followed then by munadhara, by disputation, of which he wrote a very famous and widely used book, al-Baladiyya, which is meant to have been for his son and became a textbook that again is widely used and commented upon. He says, and then theology, then scholastic theology, kalam. And again, this is a little bit outside of the scope of what we're going to talk about today, but he has entire long sections, multiple sections in the book, where he talks about what he means by this kalam. We're going to touch upon it a little bit in our second part, but in short, he is not encouraging going into the weeds as many as he felt students did in their age, to the of ilm al-kalam in masail, in issues that had very little benefit or impact. But he's talking about the foundations. He's talking about those things which at a level of aqa'id, or at a level then of the foundations of those aqa'id, and being able to express them or defend them, one has to have a certain degree of sophistication in the masail that are treated in the books of kalam. And by his time, books that he had authored himself, even if he repudiated some of them later, as he says later in the book, the general topics of first principles, of ontology, of how we know what we know, so that you shore up in the case of a discussion or a debate or with somebody who comes with doubts, so that you're able to shore up the foundations of knowledge itself, of objective knowledge, again, in a post-truth world, something even more important than perhaps it was at that time. But as he'll make it clear later, he is not talking about getting into questions which are purely speculative with little foundational benefit for other ulum. This is going to be his primary demarcating line between what he commends and what he says, take it from me, I've been there, I wrote the books, and now I renounce them. Don't go there. Focus your mind in kalam. He does say kalam, but on those masail that are of fruit and of benefit within the greater formation of the scholar and of the human soul. And this is where his tasawwuf training and his irshad was also very important, along his mastery of fiqh and other sciences. So he then says, after this, now should we do fiqh? He says, nope. Now you need to study ilm al-ma'ani. So balagha, one of the aspects of balagha. And primarily he focuses on this one, not because the other issues of balagha are of no importance or benefit, but he focuses on it because he's working his way up the sullam of skills and malaka and abilities of the student to be able to then engage with the foundations of interpretation that's found in much of usul al-fiqh and in tafsir, and then with fiqh and tafsir and other sciences. So ilm al-ma'ani is rhetoric or balagha's science of signifying meaning. How do sentences, how does word choice, how does the structure of language communicate meaning or not? Okay? How does it convey meaning according to the requirements of the context? Tamam? So he places this aspect, not all of balagha, but at least the basic mastery of this level, as a prerequisite to what comes next. And what comes next then after this is indeed usul al-fiqh. And we'll see later what degrees he's going to talk about this when we speak about the three levels model. And then and only then do we turn to what many people jump straight into, and sometimes to the exclusion of all else, of fiqh. There tends to be, in his day, and maybe until our own day, two sciences that people jump into exclusive to anything else: fiqh and kalam. Kalam perhaps in more recent years, in amongst especially English-speaking audiences, but where they get into questions without having done any of the matters that precede it, and in a fashion that he decries. And likewise fiqh, where sometimes people will then get into arguments and details about this or that without having yet even mastered the prerequisites to them. Okay? So this is the way that he lays out, and only at this point does he say, should one turn their attention to jurisprudence, to fiqh. All right? Following from this then, he says the student then should study the foundations of hadith. Again, note how this is sometimes different than approaches that are more literalistic, or that rightly perceive the Quran and Sunnah to be the foundations of knowledge, but pedagogically not the best way to go about preparing yourself. Everybody understands that I can't read the hadith without Arabic, but he's saying there's more to it than just that. And so these other sciences are preparatory in order to arrive at these crowning sciences, which are the very foundations. They're the mabda as well as the peak. Quran, hadith, and Quran. So he says you study the foundations of hadith sciences, ilm al-rijal and everything else that comes with ulum al-hadith. And then he says you turn your attention to hadith itself, both riwayatan, transmission, so of reading, hearing, correcting your copies, memorizing the hadiths, as well as diraya, understanding and interpretation. Okay, in other words, being able to understand why the wording of the hadith, be it the words of the Prophet ﷺ or of the Sahaba or the transmitters when they would interject sometimes phrases, why these words mean what they do. Okay? Upon this, and only then, he says, does one turn to Quranic exegesis, tafsir. And by tafsir, he's being very clear, and is clear when he talks about the different levels of the sciences. This requires having done everything else first, because the Quran, again, is the very foundation and the very totality of all knowledge. And so you must have an appreciation for what jurisprudence means. You must have an appreciation for what questions of belief or questions to do with the creation of the world or questions that have to do with the impossibility of multiple divine beings, all of which was given in a systematic, propedeutic fashion in other previous sciences, to say nothing of thinking correctly through mantiq and through language. Okay? He says now one studies tafsir. Now one is able to really appreciate what the ulama who wrote the tafsir on the Quran, that the student much earlier had ideally memorized or at least become intimately familiar with through extended recitation by this point, what is implicit or explicit, how to interpret, how to understand. Now they have the tools. So when the mufassir refers to something according to the schema of hermeneutics, of ma'ani, the student's able to follow. Okay? And it should also be noted that he says at this point, as far as tajweed, which has not come up in our list, or qira'at, which has not been mentioned, or marsum al-masahif, the graphical tradition of writing the Quranic script, he says these should be studied whenever the student has an opportunity before they turn to exegesis, before they turn to tafsir. So in other words, there's no one set time. It might be when you're very young, you have a teacher who's teaching you Quran and tajweed, excellent, go for it. It might be something that only as an adult you have an opportunity to do well later. He doesn't order this. These are, again, important, no two ways about it, because one might be sinful, and he says this elsewhere in the book, for reciting the Quran wrong, whereas you've spent years studying some mas'ala and kalam, but your prayer is invalid because you're doing tahrif of the words of the Quran. So it's not that he's belittling the science, but as far as a structured approach, all he's saying is before you come to tafsir, make sure you've learnt these matters. Slot them in when you have the opportunity, whenever that opportunity might be. But they are conditions before tafsir. Okay? And then finally, he says, as for sciences such as arithmetic and geometry, astronomy, prosody, ilm al-'ulūm, he says, again, these can all be acquired at any point at which the student finds the opportunity. Okay, with the one proviso, he says that before you study fiqh, and specifically, or particularly, not specifically, particularly inheritance laws, because of the fact that all of the shares of inheritance require knowledge of arithmetic, he said arithmetic should obviously precede that. So again, it's not that he belittles these sciences, or for that matter, any other bodies of knowledge as exclusionary, as long as they fit within the moral framework that he started with, but they're not ordered in a particular fashion of the studies, because you can do these things as the opportunity arises and when it best suits. But the rest of them must be done in this fashion and in this order. So this with this he concludes, again, his treatment of the first fasl, which is the section on Tartīb al-ʿulūm liman arada tahsilaha. Right? With this, he turns his attention now to the second part of this, second section of this part itself, which is bayan maratib al-ʿulūm. Okay, the pedagogical levels, of which he's going to explicitly say in the very first lines, quoting Imam al-Ghazālī, that there are three. Three pedagogical levels for every science. So first we were talking about ordering the sciences. Now he's talking about how you make your way through a given science. And he says the model, as he quotes from Imam al-Ghazālī, is three. He says there is iqtisār bil-rā, and there is iqtisād bil-dal, and there is istiqsā. So that which is a modicum, the iqtisār, the least you can possibly study in order to have said, I've studied something about this science. So translated here as the modicum. Or iqtisād, that which is moderation. Or modicum in the sense of that which is the means by which most people learn. Let's leave it as moderation perhaps. And finally, istiqsā, which is to have that ihāta that he talked about earlier, exhaustive mastery. Okay? And perhaps if we're going to translate this in a concept of levels, foundational, intermediate, and advanced. But what's important is not to just use these terms. It is important that we recall the meanings that he used in the Arabic of iqtisād, because it carries the meaning of that which is a basic sufficiency. So the first tier, the foundational tier, encompasses, as he says, that which is most commonly known in a given science. Okay? That which is most commonly known. This is about simply understanding its masail in most sciences. It's not about having analytical mastery or having the adillah and the proofs and the evidence and the hujaj and the ability to demonstrate them. It's about knowing what are the masail. Now, this is not, of course, a merely rote exercise. For some things it is. For other things, it actually requires, of course, conceptualization, tasawwur, okay, or tasdeeq, or the ability to predicate something of something else. But we're focusing on the foundations. We are focusing on the masail that are most commonly known. Whereas iqtisād, the moderation, is the second degree of what is known, a balance being neither minimal nor exhaustive, and which is much more, we could say, of a thoughtful or analytic approach. Okay? So in other words, where these things are treated with their reasoning, with their evidence, with some degree of the foundations and the bases upon which the science is known. Okay? So here the method has changed. Not the substrate, but the method. Okay? And so iqtisād, he says, in the different sciences will vary. Iqtisād in fiqh, let's say, as an example, which is a science that is mixed rational and transmitted. Fiqh is not a purely transmitted science, naqli, nor is it a purely aqli, rational science. It's a mixture of the two, as opposed to ahkam, or as opposed to other sciences that are purely rational. And so here, iqtisād will mean something very different than what it means in purely rational sciences, which we'll talk about a little bit later, or for that matter, purely transmitted. And finally, the third, as we said, istiqsā. Okay? He says, these tend to be either the rare problems of a discipline, okay, ashhar al-masail, or the, nawadir al-masail, after the ashhar ones had been from foundational and the mashhurat had been intermediate. These are now the nawadir, things that are, you only need a handful, relatively speaking, proportionate number of people to master them. Okay, as long as that's done, the fard kifaya that he talks about elsewhere in the book, the communal obligation or the communal sunnah has been fulfilled. Okay, so it's that which is above and beyond the first two levels, and its istiqsa or exhaustive, both in its extent, the number of things you need to know, as well as in the art of it. In other words, the analytical foundations or your ability to tie together this discipline to the other disciplines that are either foundational to it or that derive their first principles, as in subalternation, from this discipline. This would be istiqsa, where the person is able to tie together the disciplines all together and use that in the process of doing their discourse. Okay? So again, as an example of this in fiqh, since these examples had come up earlier, we mentioned in the case of iqtisar, he says something like quduri in Hanafi fiqh. Okay? In the modicum, moderation, iqtisad might be something like al-hidayah. Okay, where now it's fiqh. You have to understand the foundations. You must have done it's not just ahkam. You need to have done your usul and your ma'ani and other things, and hadith and familiarity with the sources of the use of the Quran in fiqh. But where the exhaustive mastery, istiqsa, would be the mutawwalat. Okay, things like Bada'i' Sana'i or even al-Mabsut or other longer works, where many masail in there, in extent and in depth of engagement and debate, are things that will be beyond even people who are only at the intermediate level. It requires simply putting in the time. These are now the specialists. And not everyone must be a specialist. Okay? I give an example now from fiqh. He gives an example from exegesis, from tafsir. He says at the concise level, for example, are works like al-Wahidi's al-Wajiz fi tafsir al-Quran al-Aziz. Okay? So, or works that give the Quran a word-by-word explanation, like tafsir al-Jalalain, for example. Okay? You can't do without these. Not to take these things lightly, he's saying. This is the foundation. Then our intermediate level works like al-Wasit, also of al-Wahidi, and there are exhaustive level works like al-Wahidi's own advanced work. So here he's giving one author who had written works at all three levels in the same discipline. Okay? And recommending these works as well, by the way. He says in theology, in kalam, the concise level would be books that only treat the beliefs in a more catechismic fashion, in short points, focusing especially on the beliefs of Ahlul Sunnah that have come from the Salaf al-Salih, from the predecessors, transmitted without engaging so much the proofs. Okay, something like al-Fiqh al-Akbar that's attributed to Imam Abu Hanifa. Okay, then you will have the works of moderation that provide the transmitted and the rational proofs, and give you a basic training in how to defend them against innovation, against bid'ah. Okay? Something here perhaps at the level of the singular volume texts that are often studied. Again, in North Africa, you have the tradition of Imam Sunusi with his intermediate level works. You have Imam Nasafi's work, for example, that was studied in the Ottoman or Indian systems as well. Something of this level. Okay, where it's not just a listing, but also it's not at the level of exhaustion. The exhaustive mastery would obviously be works that are at the level where now they're getting into topics and issues, both, as we said, in extent and in method. And here are works like al-Maqasid and the commentaries upon it of Taftazani and others. Okay, the higher level mutawwalat of these works. Now here he cautions, especially in ilm al-kalam. But the caution is also true of other disciplines. Okay, so like Ghazālī, he warns against the dangers of exhaustive study and exhausting yourself, one might even say, in rarefied theological questions that are purely dialectical, purely polemical, and maybe had a benefit at a certain point in Muslim history, but that age has passed, and there are no more people arguing about these things. So having some people who understand them in case these things reappear, there are Mu'tazili ideas that have been revived in the late 19th, early 20th century, for example, is important. But then to spend years upon these things, if that's not going to be your ultimate arena, he warns, can be a waste. And in some of the masail, he says, of kalam especially, and again, this is, as he says, take it from someone who spent years in this, he says they can be outright harmful and destructive because they're indeterminate, they're purely speculative in the pejorative sense of the word speculative, not in the positive sense of the intellectual. And he says people end up harming themselves, their intellects, their intelligence, and their morality as individuals, and then spread that to the rest of the society with no benefit and a great amount of harm. Okay, so in short, he's saying when treating this question of the three models, right, a person must think of the utility, the benefit of all of this. And so this is not a matter of saying that knowledge does not have a virtue in itself. It's saying that knowledge is never an end in and of itself, because knowledge is always ultimately for the divine, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if we lose sight of this, then one can get lost into questions and issues that are of no benefit and become a drain upon society and upon the individual. Or they might be things that do have some material worldly benefit, but if they are not framed within the broader revelatory, moral and epistemological framework, those benefits can become unhinged. And if the 20th century has taught us anything, it's taught us how unhinged knowledge can lead to great, great, great harm for all of mankind. And we're seeing this again now, perhaps in the new AI age as well. So these are important issues that were not only for his time, and they need to be translated in many ways for our age today. Okay? So this is his. This is a quick treatment of all of these questions of these two sections, again, to give a quick survey of them. Now, I want to turn to what he closes this section with, which is the question of mastery. Okay? The question of what does it mean to have kamal, or to be called, as it was actually a formal title in his age, kamil fil ulum. This was apparently a nomenclature that was used in the time, 17th, 18th century Ottoman learning. Much like maybe in some settings today, you find people who do a 3-4 year degree and they come out as mufti. What does that mean? Are they actually muftis? What does the word mufti entail? It's not that the title is wrong to use per se. It's rather his emphasis, as we'll see, about being very clear-minded of when it's merely a title to reflect a certain modicum as opposed to mastery. And so that people don't fool themselves and become deluded, or fool others, even worse, into thinking that they have knowledge that they don't. So he says on this question that whoever has completed advanced study, istiqsa, the third level, in all disciplines, again, in other words, they have a holistic and high level, a totality. So the person of the scholar is not fixated on just one aspect of reality, but they've used their learning to view through this ulum and sciences the totality of reality as it is. He says, and when they've done this to the degree of istiqsa across all the disciplines, he said, this is the person who is kamil fil ulum, who has mastery or perfection in all of the ulum. Or another nomenclature he mentions, takmil al-mawad, where they've perfected and completed to a high degree all of the disciplines in subject. Okay? Now he says in reality this is rare. This mastery at this level across all the sciences to the third degree of the 3 levels and 3 degrees, he says is exceedingly rare. And so he says the title of kamil, complete or master, in our idiom, as we would use it in English, is, he said, it's valid to use it for someone who does not have that, because that's very rare and there'd be very few people then. He says you can use it for those who have achieved the intermediate level, the third level that we spoke, second level, of the 3 levels that we spoke about. Okay, al-iqtisad. If they have finished the iqtisad and now they're in the early stages phases and stages of istiqsa, of the highest level. He says this is done insofar as figurative usage of when somebody's at the door of something, you say they are there. He said figuratively we can use it for these people. On condition, he said, that they really do have that full mastery across the sciences at the level of iqtisad. He said then this is a figurative but true and permissible, it's moral to use this usage. Okay? However, he says, as for applying the term to a student, and so this is a warning, who has not mastered some of the recognized arts and has only achieved a level of mere limited knowledge, or what I called earlier the modicum, the very bare minimum, in some sciences for that, and maybe moderation in others, he said then that is not correct. Neither literally are they masters, are they kamil, nor figuratively. And there's no justification for using this title. Okay? He says, unless one means that that person, he or she, is a master of a specific science or of a moderate knowledge thereof, then yes, that's okay, but it needs to be made clear that that's for that knowledge only. There are scholars, for example, who are masters of tajweed, and they really are. You take your recitation to them, and they're like tajweed doctors. They can highlight every slightest thing, and they've read and they've memorized, and they have both the Quran as a body of memorization, but also the ʿulūm, the books. They've done the Jazariyah, they've done the more advanced works. But in other sciences, maybe they're just at the very beginning stages. This science lends itself to tajweed because it's an art. It's an ilm that's usually applied as a fan, to being able to say, yes, someone is a master there. They are a sheikh of that science. I indicated earlier the somewhat common use, especially from traditions from the subcontinent, that use the term mufti. Again, if they mean by this that they have mastered the basic element at which now they are being trained in ifta, and they've had the basic training, perhaps what our author just said now about the figurative usage or within that specific science might be valid. But he says, if instead takmil al-mawad is applied to those who only have mastered, for example, and he gives this as an example, instrumental sciences, al-ʿulūm al-āliyah. They've spent years studying mantiq and sarf, and excellent, these are tools of knowledge, but they have actually abandoned the transmitted sciences, which provide both their foundation and their ultimate objective. He says, in such a case, this is an abuse. It's an abuse of the term, and it's abuse of knowledge and of education. And he says there is this term takmil is abused in his own time, and it's mostly been received by people who have studied nothing but a few texts in logic and in philosophy, and they understand very little of Quran. In fact, he goes on to say they can't even recite the Quran. They don't know the basic questions of fiqh, such that when they stand to pray, if they pray, he mentions at one point, they're praying wrong. And their prayers are invalid at the most fundamental levels of practice and of knowledge. Yet nonetheless, they wear, he says, with great pride, the large turban that their teacher has given them, even though they're not prepared to continue their education. And he says you find some of them adopting names and titles that if they were even to, so I'm quoting here, he says if they were to encounter al-Allām al-Qutb, perhaps what he means Qutb ad-Din al-Razi, a great scholar from some centuries before, they would consider themselves his equal. Okay, and of course implicit in what he's saying is that they are not. So he emphasizes in this section on mastery then that you must master the instrumental sciences, absolutely, but this includes those instrumental sciences, not just of the rational, which had become something of a fashion to the exclusion of other things in his age, but also usul al-fiqh, usul al-hadith, ilm al-tajweed, the elementary questions of kalam, such as the jawhar al-ard, but also in grammar levels such as mughni al-labib, or in Sarf al-Shafiyah of Ibn al-Hajib. So these are, again, just quick examples for those who are interested in the particulars of these books. Again, refer you to the text itself. All right? Tamam. Now, with this, he also emphasizes, not just in this section, but from the introduction to the conclusion, the importance of prioritizing. We've already seen this in his Tartīb of the sciences and within a science by using Ghazali's threefold model. Okay? But like al-Ghazālī and like Imam Biographical before him, he also emphasizes that understanding the moral normative value of engaging with any act includes the act of learning, as we talked about a little bit earlier. So, in other words, the hukum of the shay must precede knowledge of it, your knowledge of it, must precede your actual acting. Because otherwise, again, you might get lost in things that are either not priority or actually outright forbidden and harmful. All right? So this entails prioritizing the obligatory before the recommended. You know, not doing your nawafil, as it were, before you've done your fard. And this means in sciences, building upon the models that he talked about, prioritizing those things that are personally obligatory upon you and then communally obligatory. Or things that are sunnah mu'akkada or communally so. And he talks about this, how the sunnah can be a personal sunnah or thing that you should do, or communal, before getting into, again, things that are at best maybe supererogatory or nawafil, encouraged things. And not reversing this order like many students do. Or not hyper-specializing such that you effectively do this. He says all of this is to say nothing about what is obviously morally disliked to the point of being prohibited, makruh tahriman, or forbidden. This is, and he has sections specifically on this, including at the conclusion of his book. So he gives a warning. As a warning, it's going to be an example to students in his age. He says, for example, in his age, there's a widespread practice of the widespread reading of Jalal ad-Din ad-Dawani's Risala fi Ithbat al-Wajib. Okay, a text that focuses on the ontological question of the necessary existence of the divine as a ontological priority to any other existence. Now, this is a mas'ala of kalam, and in many ways it does touch upon and sets the basis of basic aqa'id points in respect to our belief of Allah and in respect to our belief of merely possible existence. However, he continues, he says, with which this text, some students occupy themselves, and they're still at the level of students. He says they occupy themselves for an entire year in their madrasas on this singular text. It covers only a single theological problem, namely that the world has a God who necessarily exists. It contains, I'm quoting him here in translation, many weak arguments and many disputed questions that lead only to the weakening of faith. Whoever doubts God as the creator of heaven and earth, how can that person find certainty through such a treatise? In the end, the student no longer knows whether the necessary existence has now been proved or refuted. With the conception of God the Almighty as the illat al-ilal, the causa causorum, or as the beginning of the chain of causes, awwal silsilat al-asbab. He says reverence for the Lord of heaven and earth fades in their hearts. It just becomes merely conceptual and a confusing list of possibilities. He says, thus doubts arise in those who are certain, and in those who already doubt, it increases. He says, such study is without doubt forbidden. Such study at such a stage for a student, before they're prepared or before there's a need, is, he says, no doubt forbidden, since it exceeds the appropriate limits of theological engagement. Tamam. So, with this, we conclude, inshallah ta'ala, our presentation this evening with a very brief reflection. Or you could say it's a necessary conclusion of everything that we have spoken about before, and which other authors have explicitly addressed and written about, which is the necessary connection, or you could say the symbiotic relationship between morality, between ethics and knowledge. Okay, so some details of the ʿulūm, as we've been seeing with our author, including in that last example that he gave, are only meaningful if you have a greater framework. That gives, again, by means of it, it gives the meaning of the things. We've seen how earlier he said you need to study ilm al-ma'ani to know how language conveys meaning. But having done that at the level of sciences, some sciences, without them you don't understand the meaning or the purpose and how to understand and work with the sciences that follow. And more broadly speaking, this is why, in conclusion, he also emphasizes so consistently throughout his work the necessity for people of learning, of which, of course, in our age now, learning has gone far beyond in extent and in the number of sciences, even what Tahanawi and his own work counting thousands of sciences, including many material science, what we'd call today natural sciences, and even overlapping in some of their purposes, some of the social sciences, as we'd call them today, or humanities. But in all of this, he says, for the person of learning, it's a prerequisite that they have at least the first level or second level of all that is revelatory sciences, because this is what provides the framework and the, one could also say, the safety mechanisms against particular sciences veering off to that which is out and out harmful for mankind, of which we have only too many examples in our age today, in economics, in the natural sciences, in physics, or in other matters today, in computer sciences and others. These, without this revelatory framework, there is no mooring for the morality, for human morality. It's true, as many philosophers in the 20th century who were anti-theistic argued, that you can have a society that is moral without religion. This is not untrue. But eventually, it might be half a generation or two or three, that mooring will be completely dislodged. In other words, they've only carried with them from their predecessors that which still kept some modicum, some basis through which to act and to think. And without the ultimate framework of revelation, and this is why perhaps Imam Sajuqlizadeh, like the authors before him, the long list of authors we've mentioned, always ultimately emphasize that if you're a person of learning, of any sciences, and this is borne out by the many what we'd call today scientists throughout Muslim history that were, in today's language, polymaths. They might be remembered for their mathematics, or they might be remembered for their physics, or they might be remembered for their practical arts and sciences. But they had studied fiqh, and they had studied the Quran, and they had studied language, and they were what, again, we call today polymaths. Polymaths not because this was something exceptional in their age, but because as a mirror onto our own age, it has become exceptional that people actually recall this and do this. So there is a necessary connection between revelation and the framework of being and of knowing, of morality and of knowledge. And anytime you dislodge one or the other, likewise, if knowledge is lost, the morality will be lost. When the morality is lost, the knowledge will either be corrupted or will become just a matter of power. So with this, inshallah ta'ala, we end our summary presentation of this section. Again, the work is actually a much richer, broader work, and I encourage those who have the opportunity to either read or to attend any full treatments of the works to do so, as might become available very soon, inshallah ta'ala. And barakallahu fikum, jazakumullahu khairan.
Jazakumullah khairan, Sheikh Talal, may Allah reward you for this really encompassing presentation and for this comprehensive overview and review of the book. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to benefit from it. There's a few questions online, and there's a few questions even from myself and also from the brothers. So we'll start with one question online for yourself to utilize the time. And if any brothers or sisters have any questions online, so feel free to put them on the chat, as I can see the chat directly in front of me. So the first question from online was asking, is it enough to study Islamic sciences just online, or one has to go beyond?
Okay, so again, from the perspective of what we studied now and read and reflected on with Sajuqlizadeh, you'll recall that he began with the word yulaqqan, talqeen. So this means, again, a person-to-person connection. This is foundational, because knowledge is not just information. Knowledge is also that which transforms and informs what kind of human being you are. Or one could say even in our day and age, if you are even a human being. And so this is of the utmost importance. This does not preclude the use of books or the use of pre-recorded material, but this has to come after one has the ability to do so, either independently or as an aid to the teaching, the learning at the hands of humans. So as some of the ulama have put in a very pithy statement, al-ilm is not which is in the sutur, in the lines of books, but is that which is in the hearts, in the sudur. And this is passed on from heart to heart, and then the book, and then the other technologies or mechanisms are aids to this. Now, ما لا يدرك كله لا يترك جله. If you can't get all of this, you don't abandon all of it, so one does the best they can. But the moment one has the opportunity to actually sit with people and to work with them, if you can't even do that, then attend at least live online sessions, better than merely pre-recorded. But it needs to be said, and this was a given up until very recently, and again, the ulama until today are emphatic on this point, in agreement with what he said about talqeen. It needs to be there. It cannot not be there.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan. That was a question from Brother Shafi or Shafi. I'm not sure because it's in English. So may Allah reward him. Also a question from Brother Kareem. He says, what is a recommended introductory work in akhlaq for kids in Arabic? Or even I would extend the question to English as well.
Tamam. In akhlaq, by Allah's grace and fadl and His bounty upon us, in Arabic especially, there's many, many works, both classical works as well as contemporary works that have sometimes been simplified down for children. I don't have a short list in mind for children specifically, but one might look at, in the modern setting, in the past 50 years, works of Sheikh Abdurrahman al-Habannaka in Arabic that could be at least simplified for a child. There are works such as Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda's work on akhlaq that are suitable, again, in the hands of a parent and teacher to simplify a little bit further for a child. There are books that have been taken in some of the writings of Imam al-Ghazālī and tried to simplify them again for children. I can't attest to them one way or the other. I haven't used them, but I know they exist, and one might see whether they could be of use, both in Arabic as well as in English. So that's directly to that question. More broadly speaking, I would recommend for adults, and especially those who are students of knowledge, one of two things as well, even if it takes some time, or both things. Some of the earlier ulama said that the students of knowledge were in good stead so long as they carried the Ihya Ulum ad-Din under their arms. So this is in other words, this was their companion. And secondly, the Tariq al-Muhammadiyya of Imam Biographical, who we've mentioned. It's a master class. It's a relatively short text compared to the Ihya, but it's a master class in really understanding this question of morality and ethics and why it's so foundational to knowledge. And he treats every aspect, both of the heart and of the tongue and of the body, in a way that's unparalleled. Okay, so for adults, and these are both available in Arabic, in Turkish translations, sometimes in Urdu translations, other languages, as well, more recently, some of them in English.
Alhamdulillah, yeah, that's a big blessing. If anyone has any questions from here, please.
Yeah, come.
To complement the beautiful insights from this book, what would be advisable with regards to teaching while studying.
Hmm.
Studying is not a destination with an end.
Yes.
And teaching, the issue, especially with regards to the issue of teaching, no matter when you start, after a few years, you'll probably reconsider what you taught.
Yes,
And
this is normal.
hopefully that we are wiser in hindsight. So how do we deal with this?
Good. So the short answer to this is, and it's tied to the first question we had, which is that there should be an idhn, permission to teach. This doesn't necessarily mean that, again, as the author talked about, that you're kamil or takmil fil madda, as he said. It means that your teacher deems you to be qualified to teach at least that specific subject, even if you're working through other subjects or that same subject at higher levels. Number two, assuming that has been done, again, review of these things through teaching is very helpful. This is an insight many of the old ulama of our age have commented on. One way to consolidate your knowledge is through teaching. So assuming that, again, you have the permission to do so for that given science or for all sciences, it's actually a very good way of consolidating. And as you said, you come over time of teaching, which to revise your approach or even the scope and extent or depth of your knowledge is one of the best ways to do so. And this is why many of the ulama, for example, of the subcontinent, they said, they were advised, even if you've been teaching the same book, which some of them have been for 50 years, prepare every lesson as if you had been preparing it your first time. Why? Because of the fact that you may realize something you didn't realize earlier through that process and either make a correction or a greater depth of connections. So this is the second point. And the third is that, again, teaching and studying, as you indicated, are not mutually exclusive. And many, many great ulama, I remember many of my teachers when I first started studying in Damascus, the very first year we would be studying with them, and then they would end their class and they would go study with their sheikhs. Some of them had been studying commentaries in hadith or in fiqh for 15, 20 years, the same book. Meaning they were obviously, by this point, scholars. They held sometimes major administrative posts in institutions or in government to do with knowledge and teaching, or awqaf. But there they were regularly with their own sheikhs. And this is the sign of someone who is a real scholar in the sense of applying themselves to scholarship. Because as you said, it doesn't have an end. Now, of course, there's points at which maybe for practical purposes, a person becomes the highest authority. But you will find that even when that's the case, I remember our own teacher and the teacher of many of our colleagues and teachers, Sheikh Adib al-Kallas, rahimahullah, he used to have a session where he was, he was who he was. When the mufti of the Hanafi school, a marja' for al-ʿulūm al-aqliyah, according to the way of the Bilad al-Sham. But you'd attend some of his readings in fiqh, for example, especially in the Hashiv ibn Abdin. And I remember one session where he was discussing and actually deferring to Sheikh Samir al-Nas, who was his student and his junior. But due to the latter's ihata and istiqsa in many ways, he would discuss and he would ask him and sometimes even defer to him. There was a elderly lady scholar who would attend that class as well, and again he would ask her and they would discuss at times. So the point being, even though he was the highest level of learning within Damascus of that subject, it didn't mean that it was the end of discussion and of learning. Yeah.
There's also a question, that one's for myself, about teaching mutun in English, like the ones especially that we're translating. So for example, let's say we teach Quduri or Abu Shuja', just those translations and teaching them to English. What do you think? Is that suitable? Is that suitable for awam or tullab ilm?
If in the hands of somebody, again, who's teaching them but understands and has access to the broader tradition and can, again, check either with teachers or other books or both, then, again, as an aid to teaching, this is perfectly acceptable. And many teachers have either encouraged it or done it themselves. I'm sure many people are familiar with the Reliance of the Traveler, translated by Sheikh Keller. When this came out in the early 90s, it transformed people's desire to study knowledge. And it led to many people doing so through the translation. But the translation was felicitous. It was deep. Why? Because it was done at the hands of other scholars. In other words, he had studied that text with numerous scholars, some of whom were muftis in their countries, and then revised it and had it checked even by the Azhar. So it was a very thoroughgoing process with the Arabic facing it, with, when needed, commentary, because by themselves, texts cannot teach. There's so many things implicit in the text that if you leave it at the mere level of text, it can actually misguide. It can actually confuse, which is what Sajuqlizadah was hinting at, and which anybody who's ever tried to read straight from these translations or even from the primary Arabic can attest to. So they can be great aids in the hands as an aid of teaching and not seen as the objective in and of themselves.
Brother Lidhabu asks, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Can one listen to Islamic audiobooks, example the books of hadith, or only focus on the books that are prescribed by the teacher?
If you have a teacher, it's best to ask your teacher this question, quite simply. Why? You have a teacher for a reason. And again, they can, what we've been reading with Sajuqlizadah is itself from a book. In other words, we're taking inspiration within a broader tradition. But the best thing to do is have a living exemplar like Sajuqlizadah, your own teacher who can say, this is how I'd like you to use your time. Study this, don't study that at this point. Not because that might be bad or harmful or useless, but because you can't do everything at once. And there has to be, as we saw earlier, this tadarruj, or this ladder of learning that Sajuqlizadah highlighted and others can translate into effect. So is it problematic to listen to audiobooks in and themselves? No. And some teachers might even recommend it at a certain point. And if you don't have access to a teacher, it might be better than nothing, as we said, depending on what the subject matter is. But does it take the place? No. And in fact, many people, non-Muslims as well as Muslims, have started to comment. It's been about a decade now that podcasts and the like, or 20 years maybe, that podcasts have become a thing. Now they're much bigger than they used to be. And many people will listen to entire books while they're driving to work or from work or while taking a walk or preparing dinner. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. But this is not talabat al-ilm. This is not seeking knowledge. And again, many non-Muslims who are in this space, in other words, there are people who develop the technologies, are now reflecting that cognitively they're finding that this is sometimes fooling oneself. Mm-hmm. You hear a lot, but very little sticks. You have sentiments or you have vague recollections, but you don't actually remember particulars. And they're finding that after years and years of having podcast lists, and the moment they step into the car, it automatically starts playing, they remember very little of it. And these are the people who I'm speaking about, are some of the scientists and the computer scientists who have actually built these things. So they're beginning to now have doubts about what they've unleashed. So my point is not to say there should be doubts or not. My point is simply to say that it can be an aid, again. And it's best to defer to one's teacher if you have one. And again, if you can't achieve everything, then you don't give it all up. So by all means, but remember that it's not built to do what the system that Sajuqlizadah rahimahullah outlined.
Yeah, that's very true. Sometimes they make us feel very good about ourselves, audiobooks and podcasts, but then how much we gain, inshallah, it's beneficial. I don't want to, I'm very aware of the time and the prayer, but there's two more questions. I don't want to.
And one last one.
One last one from
as
Omar,
well,
of course. And then let's take from Omar, please.
Related to what he was saying about prioritizing obligatory knowledge, in the order he gives for the beginner to study, where does obligatory knowledge end?
Where does it end?
Just mention the question.
Yeah, so the question again was that the author had outlined the distinction between obligatory and supererogatory knowledge and what that means for the pursuit of knowledge. And so the question was in relation to the outlines that we covered in the two parts about the sciences as a whole, or within a given science, the three levels, how does that correlate? Where does that end per se? And Wallahu alam, again, he treats this at greater length in the introduction, which I'd encourage you all to read the first part of the book. But in short, in summary, what he ties these together by saying that the basics of every knowledge is, as we said, the ikhtisar. And so a student of knowledge cannot be, as we read with him, ignorant of any of the disciplines at the level of ikhtisar. To do so is to be mukhil. To do so is to have a gap. And so insofar as your own personal obligatory knowledge is thereby fulfilled by that, by, let's say, learning your ahkam of salah. And if you now come upon Ramadan, the siyam, or of having to pay zakat, now you have money of zakat, etc., then you've sufficed it. You've fulfilled the personal obligation in relation to what is personally obligatory to you by means of that modicum level that we talked about. I'm using the example of fiqh here because of its practical import. As far as then other elements that might be, again, either fard kifaya, I should put a nuance here. So number one, again, if somebody else is doing it, by definition, you don't need to, if it's truly fard kifaya. But I'll put one nuance, not here from Tartīb al-ʿulūm, but something that one of my teachers in Damascus very early on likewise mentioned to us at the end of a class, which is a fard kifaya can become a fard ayn. In other words, if you begin something and very few people are beginning it, and there's a need, as Sajuqlizadeh mentioned, in society for it, then this has now been transformed onto you as a fard ayn. You are now morally in the eye. What does that mean? You are now morally obliged to see it through, to finish that study of that subject to the degree, again, normally, as he mentioned, mastery at the very least the end of stage 2, okay, iqtisad, in order to be able to benefit. And there has to be some people who have mastery at the highest level as istiqsa, so that they can deal with those issues. It be they speculative intellectual kalam, be it in Quran and tafsir, be it in fiqh, or for that matter, as he talks about and as Imam Ghazālī and others talk about, in tib or in handasa or in architecture, whatever the needs of society might be. So first of all, to summarize with your question, there's a mapping of what you need because of your actual lived practice, and you have to map that into the 3 levels. Usually it's fulfilled at the lowest level, usually, but not always. And secondly, then there's you vis-a-vis as a student now. What is it that you are uniquely placed, or Allah has placed you in a time and an age or a place where you now have an obligation to see it through at a level that would be otherwise fard kifaya because nobody else is doing it, or you're one of the few people who can. And here now this would transform, for your question, your pursuit into a fard ayn, that it could lead you to the level of istiqsa, which normally would not be fard ayn. Usually would not be fard ayn.
Jazakumullah khairan, Shaykh. A quick question from Brother Kareem. He says, mutun or poems in akhlaq in Arabic that are good to memorize.
In akhlaq specifically,
yes.
For memorization. I'd have to go back and think about this a little bit.
It's a very specific question, in Arabic. So we'll get back to Brother Kareem, inshallah. Please, talk to the brothers at Seekers, and we'll get back to the question, inshallah. Brother Daniel Shakil, it's a very big, broad question, but I want to address it because he's put it in there. So he's talking about Islamic universities. So he's saying that he studies at Al-Azhar, and he finds that the course is very complex in details, but the time to cover the material is very limited. So can we touch on the modern state of Islamic universities and the state, the difficult state that's within them generally?
I think we can do so again through the framework of what we've been reading with Sajuqlizadah, because in one sense this is exactly what he was writing for in his age about the madrasa system of the Ottomans. And again, it's something that is a problem for all institutionalized learning, which is why throughout history most scholars in the Islamic ʿulūm, as well as in some of the non-Islamic ʿulūm, would always complement this, if not dedicate themselves entirely, to then studying directly with masters, with the shuyukh. Okay? And again, in the best universities until today, this is afforded. If you look at universities that are premised on the tutorial system, this is exactly what they do. Small groups, and in addition to small groups, a lot of one-on-one time. It's a very expensive enterprise, both in material and time sense, but it produces, usually, the best quality of education. Now, that doesn't mean that it has the moral framing that requires everything else we've been talking about, but this is one problem with mass education, and the questioner is absolutely right to question it. Number 2, again, if you can't achieve everything, don't abandon everything, continue. But it might be that indeed are some institutions, and this has been a critique of and a cause for reform in the Azhar, in many other systems, and many of the scholars there are aware of it, including scholars that are alive today in the Azhar, both within the normal programs and in the extramural programs of Al-Azhar, and they are trying to address these things. In the past 20 years, Sheikh Hussam al-Azhari and others have tried to develop complementary programs or even self-standing programs to address what they saw as the almost mechanistic approach to studies, where you then just have a summative learning on any given discipline, and you don't have the istiqsa, you don't even have the iqtisad, let alone the istiqsa that we learned about earlier. In other words, you've never gone through a book from cover to cover, which would have been at the very level of actually the beginning level. Right? So, in other words, if you find this is the case with your institutionalized learning, and I don't mean to pick on Azhar in the slightest, many of us who were at other institutions saw the same, and indeed it's an issue with many quote-unquote Islamic studies programs at universities in Turkey or elsewhere today, then try to supplement it with those forms of education that will fill those gaps by finding individual teachers or smaller sessions. And this is something that, to go back to the earlier question of fardain, if you have now dedicated yourself to ulum of any form, especially of what we're speaking about, it might now be a personal obligation upon you to seek out that individualized or small setting learning, because otherwise you'll have wasted your time, the other time of others. Worse than that, you've wasted the endowments and the awqaf that people set up. Worse than that, you may end up becoming positioned as a mufti or someone to answer, and in fact you've not had the proper training, and that could lead to your own and other people's destruction in this world and in the next. So in other words, if we feel this is the case, don't necessarily give up on the institution, though sometimes that is necessary. Rather, supplement it. And there are, in Cairo and elsewhere, there are people who are giving and are able to give, and this is not a matter that is impossible.
Jazakumullah khairan, Sheikh. Any more questions from brothers here?
Or the sisters?
Then Jazakumullah khairan. I think we've learned a lot and seen a lot of the times we feel disconnected from the past and think that our problems have no solutions from the past. But alhamdulillah, our scholars, may Allah reward them. And with scholars like yourself who are also opening up the doors for us to understand this and find modern solutions. I'd also like to remind all brothers and sisters of two matters. So may Allah reward Sheikh Talal, he started today something that's some sort of a series as well. So today we've talked about mastering in general, but there's going to be a number of seminars that are happening here at Seekers Guidance, whether they are here in person or online, about mastering the sciences. So on the 22nd of May, which is also a Friday if I'm not mistaken, there will be a class on mastering Aqidah and Kalam. And that will be conducted in Arabic and in English by two valuable scholars on the subject of Aqidah or theology and Kalam. That is Sheikh Hamza al-Bakri and Sheikh Umar al-Qurashi. So please don't miss that. That will be on the 22nd of May on a similar time to today. That is the first matter. And then there will be consecutive programs to talk about mastering the different Islamic sciences. The second matter, which is very important, is here at Seekers Guidance in Istanbul. There will be a Islamic Studies intensive program. And that will be between the dates of the 15th of June and the 27th of June. So 2 full weeks for those interested in the Islamic sciences. All the details are online. It will run for 2 weeks with scholars. It will be taught in the English language, and there will also be complimentary Arabic classes for those who are interested. So please check out the program. It's available. If you just look up Seekers Guidance Summer Intensive Istanbul, you'll find it directly on Google. So please have a look at that and register as soon as possible. Otherwise, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you all, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to learn what benefits us and benefit from what we learn. And we'll finish inshallah with the dua with our Shaykh.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ربنا تقبل منا إنك السميع العليم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار ربنا أفرغ علينا صبرا وثبت أقدامنا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب اللهم إنك جامع الناس ليوم لا ريب فيه إن الله لا يخلف الميعاد سمعنا وأطعنا غفرانك ربنا وإليك المصير ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.
Jazakumullah khairan, brothers and sisters, and inshallah we'll see you at another seminar. Make dua for us always.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاكم الله خير.